Hi everyone, Dr. Williams here. This week we are going to cover avian physiology, which is a lot of information. So really we could do this for a couple weeks, but we're going to try it with one lecture. The book does a pretty good job, although it's pretty superficial overview, but I have provided a little bit more information in this lecture, especially when it comes to the brain and senses. So make sure you check out the slides, especially towards the end. Here we go. All right, we're going to start out talking about homeostasis, which is more than just water and salt balance. But homeostasis in general is the ability to maintain a relatively constant physiological conditions within the body. And this is because, as you hopefully have learned in your other bios courses so far, is that these cells have a very narrow range of conditions that they can exist in. Temperature, anions, the electrolytes like sodium, potassium, chloride, calcium. Hopefully you guys have all learned about sodium, potassium channels and the effect of calcium in all of these electrolytes in cell function. And again, this is, most organisms have a relatively narrow range of tolerance. There's variation among organisms with ranges of tolerance. And with birds, at least with temperature and physiological, birds often have a greater range of tolerance than mammals. And birds can handle higher temperatures and actually maintain a higher temperature than humans do. So we're going to start talking about homeostasis with water and salt balance. So our bodies and bird bodies are about 60 to 70% water. If you have highly fat individual bird, there's less water in fat because fat is hydrophobic. But birds don't carry a lot of fat usually. Sometimes during migration they do though. So how is water lost? Obviously of as we respire, we have air moving through these tissues and we have evaporative water loss there. About 7% of water could be lost, say, through the skin. Birds don't really sweat like we do, so we could have more water loss during exercise than birds do, just through the skin. But for birds, about 7%. Urine, about 30%, and then feces, about 34%. How do we gain water? This is going to, again, vary by taxa and what their diet is. But say for this ostrich, it's about 94% water is obtained by drinking, 5% is from metabolism, and about 2% in its food. So I touched on a little bit about sources of water. I want to kind of get into that a bit more. So there is water in food. Again, your diet is going to really affect how much water you get and how much water you need to drink. So if you're feeding off nectar, there's a really high amount of water in nectar, so they're going to have a lot of water to excrete. Fruit eaters, frugivores, again, there's more water in fruit. So frugivores, nectivores don't really have to worry about obtaining water outside of just their diet. Birds that eat other insects or arthropods as well as meat, the water is in the food. There's about the same amount of water in the bodies of that they're eating as in their own, so they're obtaining most of their water from food. Seed eaters, however, seeds have a lower water content, as low as around 10%. So seed-eating species are going to need free water sources. So then they are going to have to drink free water. There's also metabolic water. So the process of metabolism creates water. So 1 gram of fat yields about 1.07 grams of water. So burning fat will produce water. And production of water is going to vary with reproductive rate. So your energetic needs is going to be affected by your metabolism. And metabolism is a chemical process that uses energy for energy use and heat production to maintain bodily functions. Metabolic water, as I mentioned, is produced from metabolism. It's from the breakdown of food. And we can talk about how much energy you need and how much water you produce by looking at your activity budgets. So your daily energy expenditure is everything that you spend energy throughout the day. So we can think about time and energy budgets. What do you spend your time doing? How much time do you spend in different activities? And each activity is going to have a cost. Obviously, flying around to look for food is going to be more costly than sitting on a perch and waiting for food to come by. So the proportion of time that you spend in each activity affects your total daily energy expenditure, and your energy and water requirements are going to be affected by this activity budget. So over here I have a figure from another ornithology textbook, and it's talking about the time budgets with nighttime inactivity, about 46% of the time, 28% of the time foraging, 26% of the time daytime inactivity, and then running and flying, so moving around outside of just foraging. And what's the energy that it takes? Well, the nighttime inactivity is still going to take about 25% of your energy budget. 58% of your energy is going to be spent on foraging, even though you're only foraging for 28% of the time. Actively foraging costs energy. Daytime inactivity, only about 15% of your energy budget. And then running and flying, even though you're at 0.1% of the time doing it, you're going to spend 2% of your energy on that because running and flying is energetically costly. So when we think about this with birds too, we need to think about migration. When birds are making these long migratory flights, there's increased water loss through evaporation, and also they're creating metabolic water as they're flying and burning fat overnight. So with metabolic rate, we can think about this allometric scaling. So you might hear allometric scaling throughout other types of concepts. But in general, this is where you have a scaling with body mass or size. So here we have body mass on the x-axis, and this is log body mass, and then the basal metabolic rate on the y-axis. And overall, in general, smaller animals have higher basal metabolic rates. There's lots of reason for that. One is heat loss. So they have the smaller size, more heat loss per surface area. So if you have a smaller body size, you have a relatively higher metabolic rate, MR, here. And this higher relative rate of metabolic water production as well as evaporative water loss. So you have a higher proportional water turnover in small organisms compared to large organisms. So again, this is a general rule. There is going to be variation in this. There's a nice figure. It's a simplified figure in your book that doesn't have all the species labeled on it. But it shows, again, body mass on the y-axis and mass-specific total rate of evaporative water loss on the y-axis. So again, we can see greater mass-specific total rate of evaporative water loss with small organisms, and it decreases with body mass. With metabolic rate, we can be more specific. So there's basal metabolic rate, or BMR. This is the energy required in a non-active state. So you're not digesting anything. And this is within your TNZ. So this is your thermal neutral zone. So the temperatures where you don't have to spend additional energy to create or maintain your temperature. So basal metabolic rate is the minimum requirements plus resting requirements, okay? Then we also have field metabolic rate. So field metabolic rate is the measure of total energy required for physiological maintenance. So this is cellular and thermoregulation, etc., as well as movement and digestion. So this is your total energy consumption measured using doubly labeled water. So your total energy consumption over a 24-hour period. And in general, we look at this lower graph from your book, body mass on the x-axis, field metabolic rate on the y-axis, and we see that in both birds and mammals, we have this allometric scaling with as body mass increases, your field metabolic rate increases. However, look at the set point. So basically the asymptote, or this line for birds, is higher. So birds have, on average, a higher metabolic rate than mammals of the same size. Now, on this figure up at the top, we're going to mainly focus on figure A. So here you have, there's yearly variation in metabolism. So we have the months on the x-axis in kilocalories per bird per day. So we have basal metabolic rates down here. So how much energy you have to spend. Apparently this is on the northern hemisphere because through April through August we have warmer temperatures. So this basal metabolic rate is going to be a little bit lower. When we think about for temperature regulation, again, we see this line is temperature regulation. So higher energy spent on the colder months, lower energy spent whenever temperatures are more likely to be in the thermoneutral zone. And then again, more energy expenditure as temperatures come cooler. Then we have different lines here for resting, for feeding, and different activity. So here with birds, we have reproduction. So there's an increase in energy used during reproduction, especially in females that are yolking up eggs early in the breeding season before they're laying their eggs. And then there's also increased energy spent during molting and migration. With metabolism, we can think about thermoregulation. So again, it's really important that you are maintaining homeostasis, maintaining temperatures that are most conducive for cellular function. Birds are endothermic. Any individual or any taxa that has a very active lifestyle is going to need to be able to maintain body temperatures. With birds, their daytime core body temperature is 39 to 43 degrees Celsius. Now that is really, really high. Usually when I'm seeing birds incubate, at least with my warblers, they tend to incubate their eggs at 38, 39 degrees Celsius. I've actually lost eggs when it's gone above 40. So there is a lethal limit that birds are very close to. And reason why at high temperatures it can be lethal is because proteins change structure. And if proteins change structure and they no longer work, then all your physiological processes quit working correctly. However, these warmer body temperatures are really important for birds because it's better for many physiological processes. Hopefully in chemistry, you ended up doing reactions, and with warmer temperatures, you increase the speed of a reaction. So same thing with warmer temperatures within the body. So a lot of these reactions are going to be faster under warmer conditions. However, it's important to not overheat the brain. So the brain temperature tends to be cooler than the normal body temperature. And this is accomplished by heat exchange surfaces and evaporative cooling in the head. We kind of skipped over an anatomy. There was a nasal conchae. So there's a lot of spaces in the airway that allows for exchange evaporative cooling and to cool the blood before it goes up to the brain. So now, different taxa have different thermal neutral zones, different temperatures they're acclimatized to. In the field, they can handle these different temperatures. This graph with the thermal neutral zone is different from the graph in your book. It has a different temperatures for thermal neutral zone. And I put this in here because this is what we typically think with many of our small birds or passerines. We typically think that the thermal neutral zone goes from around 20 degrees Celsius to about 38, 39 degrees Celsius. If it's over the upper critical temperature, UCT is upper critical temperature, then you have to spend energy to do evaporative cooling. If it's below, say 20 degrees Celsius, you're going to have to spend energy to stay warm. One of those ways is to do shivering. So you can shiver your muscles. If you've been really cold, you've probably shivered before. That is allowing your muscles to create heat. So, of course, if you're spending a lot of time outside of your thermal neutral zone, you're going to have increased energy expenditure. So you're going to have to try to figure out some way to increase the energy that you can gain. If you're above your thermal neutral zone, upper critical limit, if you're above that temperature, then you might need to do some things to cool yourself down. There are many behavioral things that you can do, just like we would do. We might seek shade under hot conditions. We could change our posture. So by putting our limbs out, we might air out our pits, right? So same thing with the birds. This crow is kind of airing out. The feather position as well, if they, the feather coat is very, very insulating. However, if you, they can loosen up their feathers to let more air escape. Exposing apteria, those are those featherless parts, the tracks without feathers on them. And another option that takes time and is not always possible is raising your overall set point, so you can become used to the temperatures that you're in. There's also metabolic ways to deal with heat stress, and this is again where you're going to have energy costs to cool yourself. So if seeking shade is not enough to just cool you down, then you're going to have to start spending energy. Ways to do this is panting and gular fluttering. So both here, the picture from your book of the tricolored heron, they're basically moving their throat, moving air across this area to increase evaporative cooling. And here again, in this picture of the heron, they're doing gular fluttering. I'm going to go back here on this raise a set point. So some desert adaptive species have raised their heat tolerance. So example with this greater hoopoe lark, they're desert birds, they're ground foraging that can tolerate really high soil temperatures. And notice like coloration to reflect heat. So if you're light colored, you're not going to absorb as much heat. But generally, physiologically, they can have and tolerate temperatures that are higher than what normal birds could tolerate. All right, so cold stress creates a different challenge, but still you have to do something to stay warm or to keep yourself within your thermal neutral zone. When you're outside of your thermal neutral zone, you're going to have to expend that energy. So now we're talking if you're below your lower critical temperature, what can you do? And again, with cold stress, there are going to be behavioral and anatomical things that you can do, as well as metabolic things you can do. What's really cool to think about is how well birds can tolerate really cold temperatures. I'm going to start out with this example. This is a golden crowned kinglet. These guys should be coming down any time now. They actually spend their winters here. They can also spend their winters in Maine. So if you've never read anything by Bern Heinrich, I highly recommend it. There's One Man's Owl and then Mind of the Raven. He crazy person, but no, he does a great job of explaining what's going on and is a wonderful, wonderful naturalist that has done a lot of really cool studies with birds. But one of the things is he was wondering about golden crowned kinglets, how they survive the nights in the Maine woods. They can survive nights below 40 degrees Celsius, negative 40 degrees Celsius. And how can these little 6-gram birds actually survive? So these guys are smaller than our chickadees. And they have, again, multiple adaptations, and their feather coat is so insulative, so they can put air spaces underneath their feather coat to help maintain and insulate them, as well as some other behavioral and physiological things to maintain temperatures or stay alive. So in general, behavioral, birds could use microclimate selection. They could avoid cold by finding holes in trees or shelter from the wind or going into burrows, whether it's in the ground or in the snow. So a lot of like grouse, quail will go ahead and burrow down underneath the snowpack. So on winters where the snowpack isn't as high, there's actually more mortality because they can't burrow down underneath the snow that's insulative. They can do things behaviorally like huddling or in roosts. And again, that's something that penguins will do to survive the winter. So they all take turns rotating through who's on the outside. Obviously, these individuals on the outside are going to have more challenge, but the penguins all rotate through so that everybody has a chance to get on the inside. Again, I already mentioned feather position. So this chickadee here has its feathers all fluffed up and it's tucking its beak and head, the exposed parts that could lose heat, tucking them in underneath of a wing. Birds can do shivering. Their pectoral muscles and their leg muscles, by shivering, they can create heat. One thing that people have is brown fat. So a lot of times brown fat, we lose that as we age. So as we age, we tend to be less tolerant to cold. But birds do not have any brown fat. So they don't have that option for heat generation like humans and other mammals do. The book goes into detail a little bit more on this countercurrent exchange. So how in the world do the legs of ducks and seagulls not freeze off in the winter when they're standing on ice? And basically they use a countercurrent exchange system so that they're rewarming that blood before it comes up to the body to prevent it from overcooling them. They can also change in insulation. So during the winter months, birds actually put on more feathers for colder temperatures. Birds don't often store much body fat because of the trade-offs with flight ability. However, during cold temperatures, birds may store some fat, at least in low levels. So normally they're trying to store enough fat to get through either the night or maybe a storm that might last a day or two. But again, birds don't usually put on a whole lot of fat except for during migration, but they can maintain some fat during winter to buffer themselves against these longer periods of time where they need to have the energy available for heat. I mentioned on the last slide that something that birds can use is roosting together. So they can huddle together and roost. And this is a picture of some bluebirds. So I leave my bluebird boxes up all winter long. I usually clean them out in the fall to remove some parasites and such. But then these boxes are still available and multiple bluebirds will use the box. Other species will also use cavities to huddle in. So a Carolina wren. Carolina wrens were once using my gourd. I had a gourd outside and I noticed all these birds were hopping into it and out of it. So in the morning I would see at least 7 birds hop out of this gourd. It was a really cold snap, so I felt bad for them. So I gave that gourd a little extra insulation with a toboggan or a cap. I also threw an eye button in there because I thought, I wonder how they're doing and what's going on here. So the light gray line is ambient temperature. So I had an eye button on the outside of the gourd so that we could record the temperature. And you can see that, during the day, the temperature increased almost to 40 most days. But it was dipping down to, close to 0. And even one night it dipped down to like negative 14 degrees, I think was the lowest temperature. I think it cut it off there. But you can also see what was happening inside the gourd. So obviously during the day, the birds weren't in the gourd. But around, 6:30 at night, 5:30 at night, somewhere in there, the birds were coming in. Quickly, the temperature of the gourd increased inside up above 85 degrees. This is on Fahrenheit. Sorry, this was for a public talk. So I don't have the sciencey Celsius here, but in Fahrenheit. And then you can see overnight, even as temperatures are dropping, the inside of that gourd is still saying above 65 degrees with these birds. Here again, another night, not quite as cold. The birds were merely able to maintain temperatures above 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And then even on the coldest night when it was really cold outside, here we have temperatures below 0. The coldest that box got, or the gourd got, was around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So these birds, by huddling and roosting together, were able to create a microclimate that allowed them to survive these really cold nights. You can also see, every day whenever in the morning when the birds would pop out of the gourd to go out and forage. So while some mammals hibernate, like bears would go into hibernation or bats would hibernate over the winter to allow them to survive these cold temperatures, birds really can't do that because of their small body size. However, some birds can go into a hypothermia or torpor. So some birds will go down to a hypothermia, and some will actually go into torpor. Both of these are, the difference would be that hypothermia would be maybe a shorter term solution, where torpor could be maybe an overnight or a couple days. So these are short-term responses to cold temperatures with induced hypothermia occurring in a wide range of species, but with torpor only being seen in 6 families. So the toddies, I think I spelled toddies wrong, it's Todidae, the mouse birds, hummingbirds, swifts, the nightjars, and pigeons all are known to be able to go into torpor. So in this graph up here, basically you can see this is the minutes, or the temperature minimum in Celsius. So in Passeriformes, there are a number of species that can actually go into hypothermia at these temperatures. With our nightjars and allies, we see again with low minimum temperatures the number of species that go into torpor. And there's fewer species in Caprimulgiformes, so we have a low number here on the y-axis. And then also with our hummingbirds and swifts, we can see the number of species that go into torpor. So basically, down here we have, with a hummingbird, we have air temperature and we have oxygen consumption on the y-axis. So if a hummingbird is aroused, is active, you can see the oxygen consumption actually increases with lower temperatures compared to higher temperatures. In a torpid state, they're not spending as much energy down here when air temperatures are around 20 degrees Celsius, but even below 20 degrees Celsius, we start to see more oxygen consumed, metabolic energy in this torpid state, but still this is a substantial energy savings compared to if that bird was aroused. All right, now we're going to talk about food. We'll get into foraging later, but in general, we do need to touch on food when we're thinking about energy balance and energy budgets. So 3 main components in food that we need to talk about are proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. Protein is really important because this is how we make amino acids. This is how we make our tissue. So we have to obtain all these amino acids from our diet so that we can build tissue for different processes to function. We can't use carbs or fats to make proteins, but the opposite is true. So if you have a high protein diet and you're not getting your carbs, you can go ahead and make energy. You can get carbohydrates from the protein. Same thing, you can make fat. If you have excess protein, you can make some fat and store it as fat. But you cannot make proteins from fat or carbs. If you have an insufficient amount of protein in your diet, there are going to be consequences. So you might lose muscle mass. It may affect bodily functions. It would definitely affect growth. So protein is really, really important in most birds in all birds. And most birds that we see, while they might eat berries at different times of year, they really feed their nestlings a lot of arthropods or meat-based things. So here, this is with my hooded warblers that I used to work with. This hooded warbler is bringing Hymenoptera. This one's bringing, I think, a spider, an ant, a beetle, all kinds of prey items to feed these nestlings so that they have enough protein for growing tissues. Also, when we talked about feathers, we talked about those fault bars or growth bars. So sometimes as you're growing the feathers in, if you don't have a sufficient amount of protein, then there's this weak line in the feather. Fat is an outstanding energy source. This is why we all crave fats, whether it's good for us or not. It's the primary fuel during migration because for the amount of fat, similar amount of protein, fat weighs less. So it's much more efficient than protein or carbs. So more energy per unit mass than carbs and protein. And there are essential fatty acids that are required from the diet. Okay. Carbohydrates are a good energy source, but we can survive without carbs. I know, my bread, I love it. But anyways, you can survive without carbs, but you can't survive without your proteins and fats. Over here, this was, I think, kind of nice from your book. It talked about your body mass. Again, this is on the log scale and the minimum nitrogen requirement that you need. So this would be the protein. And this is kilograms per day, or corrected by mass per day. And we can see different foraging groups. So we have granivores, our seed eaters, we are omnivores, and our frugivores. So our frugivores are getting or requiring less nitrogen each day compared to, say, our omnivores and our frugivores are. The other thing that's really neat to think about is, and there's this neat the box in your book, make sure you read it a little bit more. But you can think about wild fruits. So right now, if you are going birding, part of the reason why we saw so many birds up at the ridges in those areas was because there were grapes around. So birds are going to come and eat these fruits during fall migration. Thrushes, for example, are omnivores. They eat mostly protein sources during the rest of the year, with fruit being a very small component of their diet. But in fall migration, fruits can be 60 to 80% of their diet. So these fruits can be very important. However, not all fruits are created equal. So some fruits are going to have a higher composition of carbohydrates and fats. So very good fat berries would be like viburnums. I had a bunch of birds protecting or defending my viburnums late this summer whenever the viburnums had fruit on them. Other really nice fatty berries include dogwoods, poison ivy, Virginia creeper. Those are all really nice high-fat berries that birds really need to store on fat for migration or even to survive winters. Other berries, like the black chokeberry, are mostly carbohydrate. Okay, so you're going to have these are going to be high in energy, but it's not going to be storage very long. And again, we can't make proteins from all these carbs. So there's different dietary, like digestive strategies that the book talks about. So like your cedar waxwings will eat a lot of these high carb berries and be able to survive really well on that. So the digestion time is shorter on these. So they can eat more berries, but pass them quickly through the digestive tract so that they can get enough food to survive. However, higher fat berries, these fruits are going to have to stay in the digestive tract longer so that the birds can actually make use of the fat stored in there. So they have slower digestive systems. If they were eating a lot of these high fat or high carb diet berries, they wouldn't do very well on them because they would pass them through and not be able to get enough energy out of them. Okay, at the very beginning, I talked about water balance, and then I went to metabolism. And part of the reason why I put it that way is because metabolism is creating water. So now we can go back and think about water balance and how we deal with salt and water conservation or excretion. So we see countercurrent exchange for some organisms that live in high salt environments where you have excess salt, where they have these salt glands, and then they can create a high saline solution to get rid of this excess salt. So excess salt is rarely a problem in most birds, with the exception being birds that live in estuarine and marine environments. So these taxa, the Procelariformes, Pelecaniformes, Anseriformes, and Charadriiformes often have active salt glands. So while all birds could have the indentation up here for the salt gland, these orders actually have functioning salt glands. And the salt glands can vary in size even within a season. So there's plasticity in that. Why have something big when you don't need it? And this just a little bit of information just showing you how it's kind of filtered through. Don't get caught up on these details. I just put it in there so that you can kind of see how this would work a little bit with the capillaries and the exchange. So pumping sodium chloride and getting rid of it, and then excreting the salt at the tip of the bill in this highly saline solution. All right, now when we're thinking about salt and water balance, how do we maintain that homeostasis, as well as getting rid of nitrogenous waste from metabolism? So kidneys are the main structure for this. Here's a dissected version of avian kidney, what it looks like, and then the structure of the kidney, as well as a close-up cartoon of how the nephron works. So the nephron is the functional unit of the kidney. This is what's producing urine. When we think about the length of these, they're collecting tubules, so the short loops or long loops. The longer the loops, the more water can be conserved. We can't remove salt efficiently in the kidney though. So again, that's why those salt glands on the previous slide is really important in birds that are in high saline environments. So the kidney is going to make a concentrated urine. And this concentrated urine, again, it's to help control water and salt balance, but it's really important to get rid of nitrogenous waste because the byproduct of metabolism is a nitrogenous waste product. The waste product could be ammonia, urea, or uric acid, okay? In comparative anatomy, we talk about these different strategies and energy costs and the environments that you live in. Overall here, birds excrete uric acid. So uric acid is the most energetically costly of these waste products to create. However, it's non-toxic, it's not soluble in water. So in an egg that can't get rid of nitrogenous waste, that waste is non-toxic to the embryo, and it's non-toxic to the adult bird if it's inside them. And this uric acid then is excreted as a semi-solid paste because probably everyone knows that because at some point in your life you've probably been pooped on by a bird. So this allows for a highly concentrated urine. And again, in birds, this is about 3,000 times more concentrated than the blood. So let's get into how this does this first. So we're going to start down at the bottom figure. So you have an arteriole, so your plasma or all your blood volume is coming through these arterioles, the capillary networks, and you're going to end up creating this filtrate. So about 20% of the volume filters into the nephron, okay? Things that can't go through it are like your red blood cells, different things that just can't it's not permeable, can't move through this. So about 80% is going to stay into this efferent arteriole. So again, leaving this area. So then basically within the nephron then, water is going to be reabsorbed up into the capillaries because of the gradient. So it's a high concentrated here and the water is going to move this higher concentration. And then 99% of the plasma entering the kidney returns to systemic circulation, whereas about less than 1% of the volume is excreted, okay? So here we can kind of look at the avian kidney, and again, we can see up in the kidney, we have our afferent veins. So we have our capillary beds coming in, blood coming in, being filtered, and then exiting the kidney. We have nephrons up here. I hate that they're using reptilian and mammalian type. So basically the reptilian type are short loops. Okay, so these nephrons have very short loops, so you're not going to have as much water conservation in these. Then they talk about these loops of Henle's. These are those long loops, and in the book they're referring to them as mammalian-like. Again, I hate that. Just think of them as long loops. The longer the loops, the more water conservation. And birds will have both types. They'll have short and long loops. Birds that live in more arid environments where it's important to maintain and get back all the water that they can, they'll have more long loops compared to those living in highly an environment with lots of water. All right, so here there is, again, I was talking about this variation in structure. We can also vary the rate that the amount of time that the blood is being processed. Birds have a high heart rate, high blood pressure, so things move through very quickly. So filtration happens many times a day, okay? The filtration rate, though, is if you're dehydrated, you have lower blood pressure because you have lower blood volume. The rate of filtration can fall by up to 50%. So again, these structures, this is these short loop structures of nephrons and then these long loop. And again, there's just different locations where these short and long loops are occurring within the kidney. Exercise physiology. We're skipping through these topics really quickly. There could be, again, days that we could talk about exercise physiology. But in general, take-home points for you is that birds are highly efficient overall. So their respiratory system, we talked about the anatomical, the one-way flow through of air through the lungs for efficient respiratory uptake of oxygen and getting rid of carbon dioxide. Their circulatory system is also highly efficient. They have a faster heart rate than mammals. They have a 4-chambered heart. And their heart is large. It's up to 2 times heavier per unit of size compared to other, say, mammals. Their blood pressure is higher. Their hemoglobin, this is what the molecule that oxygen binds to. So their hemoglobin has a higher oxygen affinity than in mammals, so they can more efficiently bind oxygen. And that efficiency is also really important under low oxygen levels. So birds that are flying at high altitudes or living at high altitudes, they do better because their hemoglobin can more efficiently pick up that oxygen, even though there's less of it in the environment. We also know that their digestive systems are also very efficient. Here, we're going to come up here. So this is, I just was mentioning heart weight and heart rate. This table I kind of brought in here, again, thinking about heart rate, stroke volume, cardiac output, and oxygen consumed at rest, active, and how much they're able to ramp up. So during exercise, they can have an increase in heart rate of 5.8 times. Their stroke volume, how much blood they're actually moving through, and the cardiac output, also how much blood they're getting through, really can increase. And then the amount of oxygen that they can consume. They can be so efficient, and they can get so much oxygen consumption. So at rest, really low values, but they can increase the amount of oxygen they can consume during high activity like flight or migration by 10 times. So also during migration, their digestive system changes because they do have to change their digestive system to be able to more efficiently get energetic resources from their food and to store them on. And birds do pack on fats right before migrating so that they can use that fat as they're making these long flights. And again, most birds are flying at night because temperatures are cooler, weather's calmer, less predators flying at night. But again, this lower temperature, less evaporative water loss at night. So during migration, they have this ability to use fats more efficiently. So they can actually change the fatty acid composition to increase the rate of mobilization and how that fat is oxidized. They can increase the membrane proteins for transporting lipids. So again, increased efficiency at utilizing these lipids. They can also increase the cellular enzyme activity to increase the oxidative capacity of fatty acids. So there's a whole lot of physiology underneath all of those statements, which we're not going to get into. In general, though, I do want you to get these take-home points that I've talked about on this slide. All right, I can't talk about exercise physiology in birds without talking about migration and the elevation that some birds can fly at. So most birds fly at a relatively low elevation, okay? And most of the time they're flying below 2,000 feet. However, during migration and other times of year, they can fly at higher levels. So waterfowl, sparrows, hummingbirds, other species, again, moving up higher into the atmosphere. They might be able to avoid weather systems, that kind of thing. So migrating at higher elevations. Some birds, again, can fly much higher if we have this in comparison to Mount Everest. So we know that people can't maintain very long periods of time up here. But here we have some birds that are flying at these elevations. One example that everybody always talks about is this bar-headed goose. So they are actually able to do some metabolic studies and really looking into how the bar-headed geese could do this. So they've evolved many adaptations for exercise in a hypoxia. This would be low oxygen environments that enhance the oxygen supply to flight muscle more so than some of the other species. So they have more capillaries per muscle fiber. Your book actually has some of those, like a cutout picture of what the muscle looks like. So there's more more capillaries to deliver blood to these muscles. They have a higher capillary density, so it's more packed with capillaries. The capillaries are more homogeneously spaced so that you have less distance for oxygen and waste to be traveling. They have mitochondria that are redistributed towards the sarcolemma. So this is a cell membrane and adjacent to the capillaries. So again, increased efficiency. All of these alterations improve oxygen diffusion, capacity from the blood, and reduce intracellular oxygen diffusion distances. Okay, so the less space that oxygen and carbon dioxide have to move to exchange, and also just more blood getting to those muscles. All right, avian endocrinology, again, skipping quickly through these very, very complex topics. So again, avian endocrinology, you could have an entire course on this. There are entire textbooks. This is really complex. The books skip through it really quickly. I'm going to go in a little bit more detail just because a lot of people studying birds are trying to study a little bit of avian endocrinology, and unfortunately, because of the lack of understanding of endocrinology in general, some of these studies are not as well done as they should be. So basically, your book talks about the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So the hypothalamus and the pituitary are in your brain, and then they release hormones into the blood, and those hormones then travel through the brain and the rest of the body and affect cell function. The hypothalamic pituitary gonadal is another system. So you have, in both systems, you have hormones being released from the hypothalamus that act onto the pituitary. The pituitary then secretes hormones in response to that, and those hormones go out to the body, whether it's the gonads or the adrenal glands and the HPA axis. So in general, you can think about the HPA axis, the adrenal axis, as the stress axis. It's also for feeding. So individuals that are starving will have high corticosterone levels or cortisol levels if they're in mammals. Burn patients often die from starvation, and they will have very high cortisol levels. Now in mammals, we have corticosterone and cortisol. And cortisol is usually the stress hormone, and corticosterone is usually the feeding hormone. So what makes you get up in the morning? Our cortisol levels increase in the morning. It helps us get up, get moving, and then it tends to level off during the day. In birds, they just have corticosterone, and this is released again by their adrenal gland, just like in us. But this corticosterone then is used for both stress and for feeding. If you have high corticosterone levels, it could be because you're stressed. You had some sort of stressor like a predator came by, or it could be because you are in a lower energy state, and that corticosterone then makes you go out and do more foraging. Now, the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal, the HPG, is involved in reproduction. There's multiple hormones that the book talks about. I'm not going to go into details there, but basically, just knowing that, during reproduction, these hormones change. They change monthly, they change seasonally. So what I want to have kind of a take-home point here, in addition to what the book's talking about, is that there are a lot of complex interactions and feedback loops for fine control of energy allocation. Now, back when I was working my PhD, I had big dreams of doing hormones. However, hormones are a lot harder to study in the field than I'd like. So anyways, this has way more information than you need, but I want to try to get across the point of the complex interactions. So up here, basically, I have the hypothalamus and pituitary. I kind of lumped them together with some of the hormones they produce. Don't freak out about the hormones. But one of them that they talked about is adrenocorticotropin releasing hormone that would act on the adrenal gland. If you have a lot of this hormone, it's telling you, hey, you're stressed out, create more corticosterone, go forage, go do things. And maybe don't spend as much time doing reproduction. Your HPG axis over here, so the hypothalamus, pituitary, and gonadal. And again, your hormones like LH and FSH acting on your gonad. Here I was focusing on females, so estrogen could be produced, and you would have your reproductive effort. Both of these are related. So if you're stressed, you don't have as much energy for reproduction. So there's going to be basically feedback loops up to the brain saying, hey, I'm stressed. I have to allocate my energy to something other than reproducing at this time. It can also affect your immune function. So the book was talking a little bit about immune function, the cell-mediated or humoral, the innate immune systems. And all of this is going to have trade-offs with energy regulation. So if you have lots and lots of energy, you can do feeding and immune system and reproduction and growth and everything. But if you have limited energy, you're going to have to alter your behaviors. And some of these feedback loops even can affect parental behavior. So if you have high stress, it can tell your brain that, hey, I'm really stressed out. I need to do other things. Maybe I'm not going to take as much care of my kids. So I might reduce the amount of time that I spend on raising kids. So anyways, there are a lot of trade-offs, then a lot of complex interactions here. So hopefully I didn't overwhelm you totally. If you ever want to talk about avian endocrinology, come see me because I think it's fun. All right, I do want to touch a little bit more on the steroid hormones. One, because I think this is really cool. And two, I think it has some good implications for thinking about things more complexly. So with steroid hormones, the precursor of steroid hormones is cholesterol. So you have to have, so cholesterol is a good thing. You have to have some cholesterol so that you can make all of these hormones. So like progesterone, this is what in humans and mammals maintains the uterine lining so that the embryo can implant. Without enough progesterone, you have a miscarriage. But with progesterone, basically these are steps. So you have cholesterol, some enzymes, you go to pregnenolone, enzymes, you either make progesterone or this other one. I'm not going to even try to say it. If we go from progesterone to corticosterone, again, we can go progesterone to androstenedione, so androgen, okay? So both of these can be made from this precursor, and then aldosterone, okay? But also then we have testosterone and estradiol, your estrogens. What I think is really cool is that there are, again, this is affects trade-offs. So depending on what's going on in your body and your energy state, there are receptors throughout the body for both estrogens, testosterones, and corticosterones. Steroids all bind to this corticosterone binding globulin. So this is the transport molecule that takes all of these steroids to where they need to go in the body. It's the delivery system. Like you get on a bus, CBG or corticosterone binding globulin is the bus that's transporting it. Corticosterone, though, binds more strongly. Okay, so if there's a lot of corticosterone because you're really stressed out, it's going to kick the estrogen and testosterone off. So this is just one of the ways that high stress can negatively impact reproduction. Okay, one of the ways that your body can say, hey, I'm really stressed. I don't have time for reproduction. I'm going to kick estrogen and testosterone off and focus on feeding and taking care of myself right now. The other really cool thing is that there are receptors for testosterone and estrogen throughout the body. Both men and women, genetically male and female, have estrogen and testosterone receptors throughout the body, including in the brain and in the bones. And because testosterone can be converted to estrogens, here, testosterone to estradiol, if you have high testosterone, then you're going to be able to keep making estrogen as needed. So this is one reason why men, I'm going to go to humans, men have lower incidence of osteoporosis than women's, because on our bones, estrogen binds to our bones and prevents the increase in breakdown. Okay, so we always have this remodeling of our bone, breakdown and building back up. The estrogen reduces the amount of breakdown so that we can keep up with the building up. Women go through menopause early, their estrogen declines, they lose this bone protecting ability. But however, men tend to keep testosterone levels higher through later in life, and then they have this protective effect. So that's one way that we see testosterone moving to estrogen and having a protective effect. In the brain, there's a lot of really cool studies and a lot that we need to learn about how estrogen and testosterone affect in the brain and how receptors or enzymes can convert this. So lots of cool research that is being done and needs to be done, thinking about how these receptors and these hormones affect behavior in the brain. Not going to go into them all here. The book does talk a little bit of how this is modulated, especially with sex postures, that kind of thing. So make sure that you read that. But no, there's a lot more out there. Now I'm going to go a little bit more into the brain, and this is a lot more detail than the textbook has, because I think it's important to kind of have this idea of how birds are functioning. get rid of this notion about bird brains. There's a paper by Jarvis et al. In 2005 that really started to make us rethink the avian brain, because it is structured differently than mammals. One of the quotes from that paper is, "We have to get rid of the idea that mammals, and humans in particular, are the pinnacle of evolution. We also have to understand that evolution is not linear, but an intricate branching process." Okay, so just because structures are different doesn't mean they're not as good. Again, evolution works very well to get the organisms to perform in their environments and survive. Here we have a human brain on the right and a songbird brain on the left. And again, you can see that it is a bit different, but it also has some of the same structures. So this is the cerebrum. This is all cerebrum on the humans. This is what we think of this, the sulci and gyri. With the birds, though, this is very smooth cerebrum. We have a midbrain. The midbrain is down in here, kind of hidden on this view. The hindbrain, and then the cerebellum, a beautiful little structure, cerebellum on both brains, and then the spinal cord. So some structures in the brain. I want to go through some of these because they're important to be thinking about function in general. All the brain is important, but here's some things that we really need to focus on. The medulla is a component of the brainstem. Okay, so the medulla down here is a component of the brainstem. This is what's going to control our heart rate, respiration, blood pressure, both in birds, mammals, humans, all kinds of things. The medulla is important for homeostasis. The optic lobe here. So in mammals, that optic lobe is in the back, but it's in the midbrain. It's large in birds too, relative to other vertebrates. So the optic lobe is large, again, when you're comparing size-wise. And again, the size of brain structures is often associated with the importance. And here, this large optic lobe, birds have high visual acuity. The cerebellum is, I think, a beautiful little structure. This is for our balance, our quick coordination. So if you step off of a step and you're not thinking it's there, the cerebellum is what keeps you from falling. So it's this coordination of skeletal muscle, and it's really important for information processing. The cerebrum, the cerebral hemispheres, this is where we think about all of our cognitive processing, our spatial and sensory integration. And this is also where our olfactory lobes are. And in birds, olfactory lobes tend to be small, and that's why they always thought that birds didn't have a very good sense of smell, which isn't so much accurate. But in general, that's what's in our cerebrum. Again, very simplified version. All right, so the brain, this is coming back to the Jarvis paper and talking about what we now understand better about avian brains compared to human brains. When we think about the brain, it's the sensory processing, the motor control, sensory motor learning. Again, this is processes that all occur in our mammalian neocortex. So if we're thinking about our brain, this is the front, our frontal lobe up here, parietal lobe, occipital lobe. All of this area is where we always think all these higher processes and coordination are occurring in a human brain, and smaller mammals have less developed those areas. So this paleo area, though, is what we're really thinking about. So this is the where all of these neurons are. But in songbirds, they always thought, well, this is really small. They don't have all these gyri and sulci to increase the surface area, so birds must not be as smart, or they don't have the same abilities. But basically what we found is that in birds, all of this green area is genetically and biochemically similar to the paleo area of the human or mammalian neocortex, okay? We also have striatal and palatal, again, parts of the brain. So different processing we're not going to get hung up on. I do want to go into a little bit more detail with the pallium, though. So this pallium area, all that area that was green on the last slide, again, all these things that we think mammals are so smart, birds, again, have this pallium. And the pallium has 4 main subdivisions. So it has a hyperpallium up in here. This hyperpallium, the organization, is unique to birds. Okay, this is where the learning and intelligence happens in birds, in the hyperpallium. We also have this dorsal ventricular ridge, the rest of the area, and this is where we have the mesopallium, the nidopallium, and the archopallium. So here's the nidopallium, the archopallium, and the mesopallium up in here. So in general, the pallium function is to link sensory inputs and motor inputs, just like in mammals. So our frontal cortex is for motor, and our parietal cortex is for sensory, and there's integration between those. So in birds, they have these 4 sections of the avian pallium that are connected for processing. So this pallium is an important interface between sensory and perceptual processes and mechanisms that modulate behavior. It's the basic function of the mammalian cortex. Okay, so its function is similar to the mammalian cortex function. Another little area that you can't really pick out very well, but it's called the Wulst. It's a German word, so the W is a V, so Wulst. People have done studies where they've damaged the Wulst, and if you damage the Wulst, they lose the ability to learn complex tasks. All right, with avian brains, the telencephalon. So again, this is that pallium, okay, where we think this higher order processing is all occurring. So in the avian brain, there's clusters of nuclei, so the clusters of cells instead of layering of cells. So in humans, Dr. Riley, who used to teach comparative anatomy before me, used to talk about bagels being stacked up. So the mammalian brain is like a bunch of bagels being stacked up, this layering. But in birds, an avian brain, we have clusters of nuclei. The avian pallium comprises 75% of the telencephalon's volume. And again, this is very comparable to mammals. This is processing information in a similar manner to the mammalian sensory and motor cortexes, like I talked about in the last slide. This is a slice of the brain then. This dorsal ventral ridge is gray matter, again, a bunch of nerve cell bodies that processing can go on. This corresponds to the mammalion's neocortex. This hyperpallium is more developed in crows, parrots, and passerines compared to pigeons, doves, quails, and domestic chicken. So there's differences in these areas depending on activities and how smart maybe we might think some of these birds are. Again, don't get too caught up on that because, again, all animals have evolved to do well in their situation. So this is an old version, but in general, gets the point across that the relative sizes of these different cerebral lobes or areas are associated with different tasks. So in woodpeckers, corvids, and parrots, we see these larger cerebellar lobes. So the cerebellum is that coordination of motion and reflexes. And these larger cerebellum then are in woodpeckers, corvids, and parrots is to help coordination with beak and tongue for manipulation of external objects, just like we've seen in crows using tools. So they can manipulate these tools using their beak, and that coordination of activity occurs in the cerebellum. So I'm not going to read this to you. There's so many examples of cognitive ability in birds, and I have just a few in here that you can read on your own, and you can even read about the studies if you're interested. So I do want to talk a little bit about spatial memory then. With spatial memory, especially the hippocampus is an area. The hippocampus is associated with our memories. It's associated with navigation and memory in general in birds. The Clark's nutcracker caches more than 2 seeds and retrieves them 9 months later. They have a really large hippocampus. Same thing with the scrub jay. Scrub jays have been found to have these episodic events-based memories, so they can store waxworms and peanuts, and they can retrieve those if it's within about 4 hours, but then their ability to have those stored into long-term memory are not as great. So after 4 hours or so, that long-term memory isn't necessarily there in the scrub jay like it is in the Clark's nutcracker. With the hippocampus, it's very plastic. So usually when we think about brains, we think that there isn't plasticity as much. Once you lose cells, they're gone. However, There's variation in the size of the hippocampus in some birds, like the black-capped chickadee. The hippocampus size increases in the fall when chickadees are gathering and storing seeds, so that hippocampus can actually increase in size by about 30%. It actually adds new cells and it returns to normal, so it gets rid of these cells in the spring. So when it doesn't need this expensive brain tissue, then it reduces that. And this is the first adult vertebrate to show growth of the brain during adulthood. Okay, so usually we think about this increase in brain size only occurring during development. If they damage the hippocampus, they hide the seeds, but they can't find them. So unfortunately, they've done some studies to show this. But yeah, if the hippocampus is damaged, the seed storing and hiding behavior occurs still, but they're no longer able to retrieve them. So growing brains takes time and it takes energy to have large brains. So we often see larger brain size associated with longer lived birds. And we also see this in birds with more complex foraging behaviors, any cooperative breeding birds, birds with parental care, and then also birds that play. Because again, larger brain mass is going to be associated with foraging innovations, play behaviors, cooperation, all kinds of things. All right, just briefly on sleep, to highlight some of what the book was talking about. Basically, birds do sleep. We can see brain activity with rapid eye movement, which is our deep sleep where we're dreaming. So this is, if you don't get enough rapid eye movement or REM sleep, then we don't feel very good. What they found is that birds can actually sleep on one side of their brain at a time. So here they were showing on this bottom one, this is awake left hemisphere, but sleep right hemisphere here. This shows, that birds can sleep with one side of their brain and be awake with the one side of the brain. This helps with vigilance, helps with some birds don't land, like the alpine swift will be on the wing for 8 months of the year. They have to sleep sometime during that period, and they do that by sleeping one side of at a time. We also, while we don't know what birds are dreaming about or what's going on, we do see this REM or dream sleep in birds. And they were actually able to show in zebra finches that there's this brain activity in the area that lights up when a bird is singing. So while the bird was sleeping, it wasn't singing, but basically it had same activity in the brain as if it was singing. So just like we practice things we're learning while we're sleeping, sometimes we'll dream about course content. That's helping your brain process and practice that content. All right, some of these slides are from a public talk that I gave, so that might be a little bit more cutesy. But basically, birds do have large eyes for their body size, and especially owls have very large size for body size. So if we think about, this is a black-capped chickadee skull and how large the eye is versus an owl skull. So eye structure and function, don't get too caught up on it. The book talks a little bit about things, but basically you have this fovea centralis, you have this pecten area in here. This is highly vascularized. I'm not quite sure why this is here, but again, I think to increase the oxygen ability of the eye. All right, so when we think about the eye, there's areas on the retina that have higher density of cones. Anytime you have a higher density of cones, you're going to have higher visual acuity. So we have rods and cones. Rods are going to help with nighttime seeing, cones with color and daytime seeing. So when you have a higher density of cones, you have higher visual acuity in those areas. Birds also have higher accommodation rates, so rapid accommodation. And this allows birds to, as they're flying through something, they can accommodate really quickly. Whereas us, especially as we get older, we lose that ability to accommodate when objects move closer or nearer. We think about the visual field. So we do have binocular vision that allows us to have depth perception. But there's a trade-off between having binocular or monocular vision. So If you have binocular vision, and it's a very narrow range of vision that you have that in, so you have to move your head to be able to have be able to see different areas with binocular vision. So monocular vision is going to be really important. Like, what's the field of view? So more monocular vision, larger field of view. So birds like the snipes and woodcocks will have they're eaten by a lot of things, so they have a very narrow range of binocular vision, this dark blue area, and they have a large range of monocular vision so that they can see predators coming. If you're an avian predator though, and you're out chasing your food, or you have to use vision to acquire food, it's helpful to have an area of binocular vision, and then you still maintain this area of monocular vision for your peripheral field of view. Also, our nocturnal birds have what's called the tapetum lucidum. This is what makes eye shine. So if you have a cat, you can see the cat's eye shine at night. Nocturnal birds also have a wider corneal diameter that allows more light to come in, and then they increase the axial length. So if you increase the length of the eye, you increase the axial length, and that increases visual acuity under low light conditions. So here I just put a couple different owl skulls on here so that you can actually see the eye and this the scleral ring around the eye that helps support it. Here the scleral ring is gone. Again, this is just to drive home this point of what a large space in the skull eyes make up. Owls take it to the extreme, but in general, birds have a large portion of their head being taken up by their eyes. Okay, so this is just for fun. So I had a moment claim to fame. You can really see an owl's eye through its ears. This is on the blog Why Evolution is True. It's still available. I was told that one of my pictures of an owl was being discussed on the internet in the UK, in the US, and they're like, oh my gosh, this owl is dead. And this was a picture that we took. We always showed visitors the eye and then also the ear openings. So in saw-whet owls, they have ear openings that go up on one side and down on the other side, and that's to help locate sound. But again, here you can see this long tubular eye. So I ended up contacting Dr. Coyne and said, actually, that owl was alive. It flew off just fine. And I explained what we were doing. So you can click on this link and you can read about it. I shared some pictures from our banding station, and they talk about this a little bit more there. All right, here I do want to highlight a little bit with visual acuity in birds. So birds do tend to have higher visual acuity than humans do, but not all. So this is basically the acuity scale of acuity and how much acuity you have. And not surprising, these owls are on the lower end of the spectrum. And then some birds that are really using vision as part of what they do, especially like the wedge-tailed eagle that hunts from really, really far away, has high visual acuity, is up here on the scale compared to where humans are. With color vision, again, this happens in the cones of birds. We talked about with feathers and the pigments that birds do have more 4 photopigments, where we only have 3. Humans only have 3. Some mammals don't have all 3. But birds in general can see in the UV. Not all birds can see in the UV though, okay? So be careful when you're looking at this. So there's some hawks that don't see as well in the UV, or don't see as low down in the UV as some other birds are. So there's thought that some birds can use, like passerines, can use UV reflectance in their plumage to advertise to conspecifics, but maybe they're not being as obvious to a hawk predator. Also, other mammalian predators can't see in the UV, so they would conceal them from that. With visual sensitivity, though, birds do have higher visual sensitivity, so they can discriminate between colors better than humans can. And that's because they have these oil droplets in the cones that help to filter. They basically filter out the lower wavelengths. And it narrows the wavelengths that are actually reaching the cone, allowing for increased discrimination among colors. So while I might see yellow or blue, birds might see a lot different gradations in those colors. Okay, with hearing, Birds do have ears. They're often covered by a flap to protect them. They have a stapes, or this columella, that transmits sound waves to mechanical waves to fluid waves in the inner ear, just like we do. Owls take it to more of an extreme. They actually create this facial disc to help to localize where the sound is coming to. So they have these specialized feathers that head shape. This disc helps to send sound directly to the ear opening or the auricular opening here. The feathers are different structured over the ear. So if you ever look really closely, especially at an owl, you can see differences in that feathers, and that allows that sound to transmit to the ear more efficiently. I think what's really cool too to think about and compare our hearing to what birds can hear. So this gray area, okay, this is frequency in kilohertz here, and the intensity or how loud the sound has to be on the y-axis. So basically all of this gray area, if there's a sound in this gray area, we can't hear it. It has to be louder than this at all these frequencies. Birds tend to have a narrow frequency range compared to mammals that they can hear in. They have maximum sensitivity between 1 and 5 kilohertz. So most birds in general have their best sensitivity to hearing between 1 and 5 kilohertz. The lines in here we have for strigiforms, owls, the passeriforms, this light dotted, and then other non-passerines here. Again, most birds do not hear ultrasonic sounds, but some birds do, like mouse birds. Owls can hear low and high frequency sounds very well, though. So so with the owls, again, they can hear frequencies of sound at a lower intensity than humans can. What's really kind of cool, if you go to this Audio Notch app, it's actually for tinnitus, for people that have ringing in the ear to find out what frequency they're at. You have to modify a little bit because this is kilohertz, and I think their scales a little bit differently. But you can go ahead and play sounds at different frequencies and see if you can hear them and see when you can't hear them. A lot of people, if they have hearing damage, they can't hear those high frequency sounds. So take a few moments. I know you have a lot to do, but take a few moments and go ahead and play around with that and see what frequencies you have and how you compare with owls as well as other birds. Okay, so in the notes of this slide, there's more information here, basically copied from the figure legend. But here, basically, what I want to think about, again, this is a scan of an owl from the Whitmer lab, and it's highlighting some of these different areas of the brain. Over here, this is some of the pathways for hearing. Big take-home message is that owls can detect differences of 150 microseconds with a time lag of about 10 microseconds. So they can really discriminate with sound, whereas humans, we can only detect differences of 570 microseconds. So this will come into play a little bit more when we get into song later on. So what we hear from birds is very different from what birds can hear, and it's because of their capacity within their brain to detect much smaller differences in sound. Okay, that's it. So take your time reading through this chapter, kind of going through some of the extra information that I gave you in this PowerPoint, and study really hard for the exam next Tuesday. See you later. Bye.